G'day, and welcome to the Seacreatures Podcast, a show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. Each episode, we chat about a specific sea creature with a guest who has spent time and interacted with this ocean animal. Our guests range from marine biologists, underwater photographers, scuba divers, citizen scientists, authors, and anyone with an intense passion for marine life. My name's Matt Testoni, and I'm all of the above. And joining me for this episode of the Seacreatures Podcast is Zoe Kean, and she's a science communicator and author of a new book, Why Are We Like This? Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be chatting all about stromatolites, which some people may never have heard of and may not realize are actually a sea creature, but they're a pretty important and cool sea creature. But before we jump into them, tell us, Zoe, how you kind of got into learning about stromatolites.
Yeah, so one of my great passions in life is evolutionary biology. And the thing that's so exciting about evolutionary biology is when you get into it, it tells us the story of who we are, how everything around us came to be, and how connected we all are. So there's nothing more exciting than the story of life on Earth. And for around 80% of life on Earth, stromatolites were kind of the biggest game in town. So I always had this fascination with them because they're so ancient, which I'm sure we'll get into. And I really wanted to understand them a little bit more because I thought if I want to know our roots, where we came from, the kind of the context from which, our weird and wonderful world emerged, it would be really important to kind of get to this kind of ancient life form and understand them. So they've always intrigued me for that because, I love like a big charismatic megafauna. I love thinking about elephants and I love thinking about whales and I love thinking about, chimpanzees, or I love thinking about kind of recent human evolution and that kind of thing. But there's something intriguing about like where it all began.
Yeah, and so I guess they kind of are the opposite of like a whale or something huge, aren't they? So tell us exactly what a stromatolite is.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm almost breaking the format because they're not an animal and they're kind of almost like the legacy that life leaves behind. So stromatolites are these incredible structures that are formed by single cellular organisms, and often these are photosynthetic single cellular organisms, so tiny little cyanobacteria that are photosynthesizing in the ocean, and they live in places where they're not being predated on by things like snails that love to eat single-celled, like lovely slimy gooey cyanobacteria. And essentially what they do is they form their own structures. So a stromatolite is essentially a giant limestone rock that over thousands of years has been created layer by layer by layer by layer by a community of single-celled organisms. And they do it in two ways. So one way is by trapping and binding sediments that are coming past them. So they're sticky and gooky, and sand and that kind of stuff will go past them and it'll kind of just like get trapped in the sticky gooiness. But the other thing they do is they can precipitate minerals from the surrounding environment. So if you think about the ocean, it's got lots of stuff in it, and just like a coral makes its stony skeleton from the minerals that are in the seawater, stromatolites can do the same thing. So if you cut one open, it's kind of like an onion, it's got layers, or an ogre, it's got layers. And those layers are created by this precipitation effect where, these tiny little single cellular creatures sea creatures, are making what can be sometimes structures that are over 1 meter in height, which is an incredible kind of like slow persistence of life. And I love that. I love when life makes rock. It's really cool. And I was talking to a scientist about it, and she was like, the way to think about a stromatolite is it's kind of like a footprint of a dinosaur fossil, in that the rock itself isn't the life. The life is just the tiny film on the outside. But like a dinosaur, it got up and walked away and died millions of years ago. Whereas when a stromatolite is still making itself, the last little bit of film is still making that kind of limestone stuff that it's made out of. So it's like this imprint of life, which is really cool.
Yeah, and I guess like the cyanobacteria is kind of like our sea creature for this episode.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And so they used to be prolific, I guess, across the whole planet. Is that correct?
Yeah. So pre-multicellularity, there weren't things that were able to come along and eat a delicious algal mat. So you were able to get these incredible stromatolites forming, and some of the most exciting stromatolite fossils are actually in Australia. So I went to Bullabardip, which is the museum in Western Australia in Perth, and they've got stromatolites there that are about 3.4 billion years old. And it's absolutely wild. So you go into this room that is very dimly lit, and you you wander in and it's dark and it's moody, and then it's almost like church-like, and at the end of the room is this big lumpy orange fossil, and it's a 3.4 billion year old stromatolite fossil, and it looks like a relic in like a Catholic church. Like, if you've ever been to Europe or somewhere where there's like these really old Catholic churches, and they'll have this beautiful kind of gold relic that's got, the toenail of Saint Stromatolite in it. It's kind of set up like this, and so it almost feels like whoever set this space up kind of had a sense of just how profound, and like not wholly in like a religious sense, but just like, it's a profound thing to have to think about life from over 3 billion years ago. And that stromatolite was actually found in WA in a place called North Pole, which is confusing. And there's also, I've been to a place in, I think, Alaska called North Pole. Anyway, so there's a place called North Pole, but it's in WA and it's in the desert, and there are these incredible fossils of ancient life that are over 3 billion years old. And essentially, for a long time, single cellular organisms were the only game in town. And we don't know necessarily with some of these really ancient stromatolites whether it was cyanobacteria forming them. Like, some of them are probably pre-cyanobacteria, but you can actually have these microbial communities forming without photosynthesis. So some of them are probably from a pre-photosynthetic world as well.
Cool. And so this rock in the museum, that I presume everything on there is dead.
Yes.
But they still live and they still have tiny communities, is that correct?
Yeah, and WA is the place to go. So this was my epic quest to see stromatolites. So I took my mum with me. We went for 2 weeks. This was last year. And we went we had a few days in Perth, and we went and visited the stromatolites twice in the museum. I went in twice. I think she saw some other things. She went in once, and it was pretty profound. We really enjoyed it. And then we got on this small regional flight up to Guthrie Shark Bay. And that's just the most incredible place in the world. So if you're looking at a map of Australia and you look at the kind of most western tip of mainland Australia, that's where Shark Bay is. And you kind of notice on the map that there's these like peninsulas and islands hanging off. And so Shark Bay, in language, it actually means I think it's two waters. And it's essentially, there's a big peninsula in the middle and these islands that, protect the place. And there's this section in Shark Bay, which is massive, called Hamlin Pool. And it's just absolutely bizarre. It's the most incredible place I've ever been, or one of the most incredible places I've ever been. I don't want to diminish the Tasmanian Highlands or like the Franklin River or anything, but it's like one of the most incredible places I've ever been in my life. So just out of this world in terms of its beauty. But the underwater ecology of Hamlin Pool is really weird because it's more water is able to come in than is able to come out because of this quirk of like the seagrass, and it's very shallow, which means that you've got an incredibly hypersaline environment. And because it's so salty, so hypersaline, very salty, there's not much that can survive there. So you don't have all of these like tiny little snails that would love to eat cyanobacteria. You don't have a lot of fish. You do have fish. You do have some jellyfish. You've got a lot of sea snakes, but you don't have as much as you get in the rest of Shark Bay, which is, this incredible environment all to itself. And so it's one of the few places in the world that stromatolites are able to really live in their full ancient glory. And you're not allowed to, go swimming there without a guide. So you have to go get a guide. We had this wonderful guide named Luke. He took me and my mum out and these two other tourists. And you go out on this like red dirt road. So like picture you're going on a red dirt road. There's spinifex on either side. And you're just kind of going for maybe like, half an hour or something. And then you go over a red sand dune, and suddenly you're at this blinding white beach. And one of the other weird quirks of Hamlin Pool is that one of the other species that survives there is a cockle called the fragrant cockle. and it has a relationship, much like coral does, with a photosynthetic algae, and so it's able to live there in the kind of weird and very sparse environment. And so it's also bright white and about the size of my thumbnail, and so instead of having a beach made of sand, you have a beach of dead fragrant coppel shells.
Whoa.
It's just completely shelly, which means it's bright white. So it's like red sand and then this bright white beach, and then like Bombay gin coloured water with these lumps in it. And you go down to the lumps, and the guide tells you how to get into the water, because you have to be very careful not to touch them. You have to be very careful not to kind of step on them, all that kind of thing. So he'll kind of navigate you in, and then you lay flat on the water and go for a swim. It doesn't actually get that deep because it's such a shallow place. So I think I maybe went out, I don't know, 100 metres out, and it's like 1.5 metres or 2 metres deep or something like that. And the stromatolites are there, and they're just these incredible, massive structures. And I always thought that they were kind of limited to a small part of Hamlin Pool, but they actually go, this Hamlin Pool's massive, so they go kilometres, like this massive, like kilometre-long stretch, where a lot of, there's a viewing platform in another section of Shark Bay, which is like kilometres away from where we were able to go. And yeah, you can just swim around and see the stromatolites. And because it's such a strange place and it's like fairly devoid of life, you can really kind of like get yourself into the mindset of being in the primordial soup. Like, just don't notice the little fishes, try not to notice the giant sea snakes, and think, I'm living like in the primordial soup. This is before multicellularity. This is kind of where life began. But you can only avoid the sea snakes for so long, because they, like, I've got, like, my hair's a bit shorter at the moment, but at the time I had very long dark hair and I had a snorkel, and so they were completely fascinated with it. And I'm, being a temperate water person, not super used to them, and I had this one coming up to me and it was headbutting my GoPro and headbutting, like, my goggles, and like, it was so terrifying.
Wow.
But it does mean that I've got this like very clear memory of the stromatolites, because I have this like just adrenaline response to this whole thing. But it was an incredible place. It was a real buzz to go and see them, and you can do all this other amazing diving and snorkeling in Shark Bay, which we did. You see sharks. It's very cool. But yeah, in this spot, Hamlin Pool, you can actually get a glimpse of what life was like pre-multicellularity, which is amazing. And to think that, you know, I mean, WA is a big place, but not that far north and a little bit east, you've got those 3.4 billion year old fossils. It's pretty mind-blowing. There are other spots in WA that there are stromatolites. I think that, you know, the Hamlin Pool ones are kind of like world-class, the best. I think there's some in South Australia as well. There are, you know, they do form in different places around the world. There's a big reef in the Bahamas, and also some lakes in Antarctica also form stromatolites. So, you know, just think of anywhere that's a really terrible environment, especially for mollusks and, you know, things that would like to eat bacteria. But I must say, a lot of the stromatolites in Shark Bay aren't technically stromatolites. A lot of them are thrombolites or microbialites, and microbialites is kind of the broad umbrella term for all of them. And stromatolites refers to the way they're formed. A thrombolite, like, you know, if you've got thrombosis, it's like you have clotty.
Yeah.
They're kind of formed in a more clotty way, and stromatolites are in a more like lamination-y way. But because they were originally described as stromatolites, they're kind of just colloquially called the stromatolites. So you could actually someone about some of them, but why bother? Like, stromatolites is kind of the term that we're all going with, even if it's a little bit scientifically inaccurate. Or I call them the stroms.
The stroms.
Yeah.
I love it. And I love the fact that it's almost like a little bit of danger, because if anyone doesn't know, sea snakes can be very dangerous. So it's kind of like this Indiana Jonesy like quest to see, you know, ancient marine life.
I felt so adventurous, especially seeing the sea snakes, because, yeah, as a southern water person, they're totally out of my kind of ken. And at the time, I thought that one bite had enough venom to kill 100 people. But I made a TikTok saying that, and a sea snake researcher actually fact-checked me and said that is what we used to think, but we think that potentially it's maybe more around 10 or 12 people, something like that.
Just 10
or 12 people. And I'm fewer people than 10 or 12 people. But he said that it was fine that I said that, because that was generally what we thought. But he was researching all these really interesting different things about sea snake venom. So watch that space from random fact checker on TikTok. I'm like excited to see what his research into sea snake venom is. I don't know what it is, but he said that they're not as bad. But I mean, still pretty bad. But they're friendly. They're like like very sweet and lovely, maybe a little turned on by snorkels, which is a bit weird, but they're very inquisitive and talking to people who do a lot of diving around sea snakes. It seems like different sea snakes have different personalities. The person that took us out there also works for a local aquarium, and he was saying once he was out like collecting things for the aquarium and the sea snake just kept getting in his bucket and like was like just kept like swimming around his legs and like was hanging out, and he was like, oh well, I guess I'll just take you with me, and took the sea snake to the aquarium. The sea snake lived there for like a month or something and would like hang out and like get fish from people and was like really chill. But he said other sea snakes have been like, what are you doing here? I don't really want you here. But they, don't pick one up, don't like get in its business. But if you see a sea snake, it's like anything, you're meant to just be calm, and then maybe it'll like swim through you and stuff. But one of them was following me around, and I got very uncomfortable.
I've had a sea snake wrap itself around a fin I was wearing, and they are, even though you look, you're like, I'm going to be fine, it is slightly terrifying.
Yeah, like we just like have this physiological response. I had this one like it went through my hair and stuff, but I was out there alone because everyone had like got their fill of stromatolites, and I had been out there for like over an hour, and then it was like coming and hanging out with me, but then I couldn't tell if it had gone to my fin. I don't know if you felt like this when you had one around your fin. You're like, can I kick? Or like, so I just like was frozen for a while, and I thought it had gone, and then it like swam through my legs and away, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I didn't kick.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Well, back to the world of stromatolites. Before we talk a little bit more about like their important role and why they're so old and all those sorts of things, tell us a little bit about how big were these kind of rock formations, these stromatolites?
Yeah, so the ones that I was seeing, the tallest I'd say were maybe about 60 centimeters. And then as you got further, like the deeper I got, the smaller they got. So they started out being these kind of towers, and then they were going into these kind of like beautiful mosaic pattern blobs. And then at the furthest part, they were actually just microbial mats. So they weren't stromatolites at all, but they were their own very interesting thing, and people study microbial mats. And so that was also exciting to see. But they can get quite tall. So the ones that I was seeing, just because where we were in the bay, kind of just got to that height. But I think that don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure that they can go over a metre. And you do see images of people swimming among stromatolites that are quite tall. Yeah.
How old would like a metre long stromatolite be?
Oh, a couple of thousands of years. Yeah, they're real slow.
Yeah, cool. And so they kind of transformed the Earth, from what I understand, just to, put it blandly. Tell us like how that works.
Yeah. So the Great Oxygenation event, was a pretty wild time in Earth's history. So it wasn't just stromatolites. It would have also been photosynthetic single cellular bacteria and this type of thing free floating in the ocean. But a lot of this event, which we'll describe in a second, would have been caused by photosynthetic algae that was living in stromatolites. And essentially, pre the evolution of photosynthesis, there wasn't much free oxygen about. So we now are adapted to a highly oxygenated world, and that's what life on Earth has adapted to. But imagine a life pre-oxygen. Most life on Earth, oxygen was kind of toxic for it. And so suddenly you have all these photosynthetic kids on the block, and it completely changes the entire chemistry of the Earth, liberating all this oxygen through photosynthesis and causing a really huge mass extinction of a lot of single cellular life on Earth. But, one of the kind of interesting and comforting things about evolutionary biology, and it's not in any way an argument for environmental destruction, but is the adaptability of life, and the way that often after some sort of horrific event like that, you end up with a new opportunity. And of course, oxygen is really, really great for running a high metabolism. And so after you have this event where there's suddenly all this oxygen in the world, and a lot of things go extinct, you've now got all this oxygen in the world, and life that is a little bit more dynamic can evolve. And so having more oxygen probably led to, us being able to get a little bit more complex, become multicellular, all of that type of thing. So there's really interesting hypotheses around what oxygen and the level of oxygen available to species has meant for evolution. So there's people saying that, potentially the brain and consciousness itself wouldn't have been possible without a certain level of oxygen, because consciousness is kind of metabolically expensive. So yeah, that's something that I found kind of fascinating. I was like swimming over these stromatolites and thinking, wow, the kind of work that you're doing here, just like quietly, innocently photosynthesizing, nearly destroyed life on Earth forever. Like you nearly had your evil mastermind moment, but then you actually created something beautiful. And the species that is forming the stromatolites at Shark Bay is a species of cyanobacteria that has been around for billions of years. So the bacteria can evolve really quickly. They can do a lot of really funky things with their DNA to mix things up and change. But this particular species has been around for potentially 1.8 billion years. So the stromatolites that are formed in the Bahamas are formed by a different species and don't have quite so ancient a lineage. But when you actually are at the Shark Bay stromatolites, you're seeing not only a kind of structure and a way of life that has been around for ages. So stromatolites are kind of like, they're the structure, and that's that kind of ancient legacy that goes back to before photosynthesis. But you're also seeing a species that has been around for so long and that has probably had a really big part in the formation of life on Earth and creating this amazing oxygenated world that we all live in. So that's pretty I found that profound.
Yeah, and I mean, what a kind of like way to advertise a tourist attraction, I feel like. Come see the original life that started it all.
I know, but interestingly, when I was there, they said, no one really wants to do the stromatolite tours. Like, I called up ahead of time and said, I'm coming up. This is actually a research trip, so I really need to go, and this is the only way to go. Will you be able to run a tour? And they're like, you've got to be able to get 4 people in the car. And, I know that you're here for 2 weeks, but I can't guarantee we'll find, another 2 people in the car. And I was like, well, I'm so desperate. I'll spring for the other things if I need to. This is the entire reason I'm coming to Shark Bay. But luckily, I didn't have to do that. And they apparently were advertising it as an author's doing a research trip and you can come along and have a look. So maybe after this, there'll be a few more people who want to go and see them. And I think it maybe draws people into the area, but it's not necessarily a huge tourist site. And I think as much as I found it really profound going there, and I would recommend people to go there, it's, there's a lot of culture that is connected to that place. Stromatolites have a big role in the local culture there. They're really important scientifically, and there's other spots in WA where you see a lot of tourists have come and kind of we were talking about those Shelley beaches. They've driven their cars all over the Shelley beaches and crushed them and that kind of thing. So I'm glad in a way that it's not a big tourist site, but I do think that if people go there in a way that's thoughtful and, respectful to the space, I think it's a very worthwhile thing to do. And I would love people to engage with them more, the idea of stromatolites and just the idea that, especially in WA, there's this incredibly ancient heritage that we are custodians of here in Australia. And a lot of the fossils that are found in WA tell this story about really like some of the first life on Earth. And that's something that's so important and something that we should be proud of, but we should also be, advocating for the funding of research for, and, that should be an exciting thing to see in museums and just should be a part of, I think, how we understand the continent, because it's so cool. Like, this is something that we can give to the Earth. It's like part of our story, and knowing that it comes from WA and being like, hey, we've got this piece of the puzzle here. I think that's so cool.
Yeah. Is it a protected site for UNESCO? Is it a World Heritage Site or not?
I think that it is. I'd have to check, but I'm pretty sure that it is. And there are UNESCO sites in that region for other reasons as well. So there's really incredible biodiversity in the national parks there. There's off one of the islands that I was talking about that makes the really interesting geography. There's an island called Dirk Island, and that island has recently been made a bit of a sanctuary for a lot of the species that have been really hammered by foxes and cats on mainland Australia, and they've been reintroducing species to Dirk-Hartog and like making it predator free and putting a lot of work in there, working with traditional owners and also working with local rangers and that type of thing to make that place a bit of a safe haven for a lot of those small furry species that just have such a hard time on mainland Australia. So there are incredible things happening in that part of the world that I think have helped it get World Heritage or definitely get special protection statuses. And it's just, there's so much interesting stuff going on there in terms of the ecology of the place, but problems around that too. So we're talking to this guy who was saying that they have problems with poachers coming through and trying to get some of these exotic animals because like they're too, for us they're not exotic, but for other markets they are. And the wildlife trade is one of the biggest illegal trades in the world, and so that can be a real problem there. So it's a incredible place with these incredible species, and you get to see little thorny devils, and you get to see like the footprints of marsupials that were like on the brink of extinction. And then also outside of the like hypersaline Hamlin Pool area, you get to swim and see like sharks, but also it's kind of where the coral reef ecosystems are hitting the temperate southern reef ecosystems. So you get to see corals and you get to see this kind of amazing kind of slightly more tropical style stuff, but you're also getting southern species coming through. So it's this really incredible place on a lot of fronts, culturally, ecologically, geographically, and just anywhere where the red desert meets the blue sea. It's not something I'd really seen before. I spent the first 3 years of my life in WA, but hadn't properly been back. I'd been back once for like 2 days for an event, but I hadn't actually spent time there since I was a very little kid. And it's just so different to what I'm used to on the East Coast. It's just a completely different world. So it's like very blasted into my brain, this like absolute incredible place. And stromatolites are just part of that story and connect us to deep time.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's instantly kind of added it to my bucket list. And usually I would ask, like, where do you go to see stromatolites? But I think we definitely know that's probably like the best spot.
That's the best spot. But there's also, it is a bit of a hike. So there are some more accessible ones in WA, I think, as well, South Australia. The bottom of a lake in Antarctica is probably too tricky. And then there's the Bahamas as well. And that stromatolite system is really different to our one. So if you become a stromatolite head, you could go and see the difference. And I've interviewed some stromatolite heads and the people who study them for a living, and they say that it's a real different feel to them because it's a more kind of dynamic system. Hamlin Pool's like pretty chill and flat a lot of the time, whereas the Bahamas system's kind of got a little bit more energy in it, so they're forming in a very different way.
Yeah, cool. Wow, the real history of the planet. And so before we kind of wrap up, you've got a new book coming out and it starts and ends with stromatolites.
Yes.
Like, explain to us, like, how is it the story? Like, what's the book about and why are stromatolites so prominent?
So the book is called Why Are We Like This? And essentially it's looking at life's big questions through an evolutionary lens. So, why do we have sex? Why do we get cancer? Why do we drink? Why do we sleep? Why do we have consciousness? Every question's got a bit of ball of tension around it, this kind of like evolutionary mystery. So if you think about something like cancer, we've been around for quite a long time as multicellular organisms, and you would think that we would have evolved to not get this thing that kills us. Or why do we age? Same thing. Why haven't we just evolved to be immortal? And how has natural selection kind of not pushed us in the kind of direction of immortality? And so every chapter is kind of like its own separate thing, but they also kind of connect and build up, I guess. And the reason why I started with stromatolites and also ended with stromatolites is that kind of deep time connection. So it's a book about things that really touch humans. So they're all things that we grapple with. But I wanted to look at kind of how the whole history of life on Earth got us to a point where we need to sleep for a third of our life. Like, that's kind of weird. Or we have a penchant for drinking alcohol, even though it's a poison. And so that's why I started with stromatolites. Originally, it was going to be in my chapter about sex because I wanted to talk about kind of DNA and how DNA started chopping itself up and doing different things. But I've actually founded a home talking about consciousness and kind of talking about where do we start to kind of come into ourselves as experiential beings. So first chapter is just thinking, how did life go from single cells that formed rocks to multicellular creatures that snorkel over rocks? And then the final one kind of goes, well, and how do we then get to a point that we're thinking and feeling and having this experience of the world. And that chapter looks at a whole range of species, and something that I kind of keep coming back to in that chapter is fish, because I was looking at all these little fish around the stromatolites, and they're kind of interesting in terms of vertebrates because we went on our own evolutionary journey separate to fish a really long time ago. And when I say fish, I mean kind of bony scaled fish. Yeah, you know what I mean when I say fish. And there's this kind of, I think there's like two ways that you can think about consciousness. You can think about consciousness as some people think about it as only belonging to a very small minority of species, and they have to have very complex brains, and they have to be kind of pretty similar to us. Maybe it's just humans, maybe it's humans, chimps and dolphins. Like, they have a very restricted view, and others have a very large view where consciousness is extended to octopus, extended to maybe even single-celled, extended to plants. And I think the kind of fulcrum around that is fish. You know, where you land on fish consciousness kind of can determine where your brain goes, because, yeah, they have different brains to us, but where we've got, it's a similar base structure, if that makes sense. So I kind of kept coming back to them and fish welfare, and, you know, grew up spending a lot of time in the water and started to form a lot of my early scientific and also ethical kind of things around animal rights and that kind of stuff around fish. So that's how it ends, and that's what brought me to the stromatolites, and I really wanted to go there as the first of my research trips for the book. One, because I really wanted to write about them, but also starting the book, I wanted to kind of ground myself in deep time and really just get myself in that, history of life on Earth stage. So yeah, every night after doing a little diving adventure, I'd go to the pub, have a pint and write out my ideas for the book. And
Have some poison
and start planning. And then when I got back, I started writing the book in earnest, yeah.
Awesome, cool. Well, before we kind of wrap up, are there any remaining cool facts about stromatolites that we haven't chatted about?
Oh, we've chatted about a lot of the cool facts that I know. Cool facts about stromatolites. I mean, the stromatolite heads will be like, you missed this thing. There's the fulcrum and there's some really interesting stuff about the way they're formed. But yeah, I think one of the things that's really cool, I can't remember her name, but one of the really early researchers in stromatolites was this incredible woman who was working in WA. You know, there's a lot of barriers to being a field scientist in the mid-20th century for women. And, you know, you've got your Fossies and your kind of big names with Jane Goodall or something, and so she was kind of that for stromatolites. And I actually can't remember her name off the top of my head, but there's this kind of like incredible history there of this amazing researcher who really kind of made the world take notice of stromatolites and was a big part of their conservation. So I think for me, something that I missed, and I can't even remember her name, so I haven't brought it to you, but is this history of kind of women in science and the fact that they, because something can be amazing, but it often takes the scientist to show us why scientifically that's amazing. And stromatolites kind of, you look at them and you're like, oh, that seems like a profound thing.
It's a nice rock.
It's a nice rock. It's like got this kind of gravitas to it. But if you then understand its connection to deep time, you're like, whoa, that's a nice rock. And, you know, it takes a scientist to bring you that sometimes. So I think that would be the cool thing.
Yeah, cool, awesome. Well, thanks very much for being on the show. And if anyone wants to follow you, see your book, all that kind of stuff, learn more about stromatolites and all kind of cool things, what should they do? Where should they go?
Yeah, so if you're a person on social media, you can go to, I've got an Instagram at Zoe, Zoe Kean, or _ Kean, Kean, _Sci. So you can see my work there. I'm also on TikTok, where I put a lot of these videos up, so you can actually go and check out the stromatolites and the videos that I took of them, the sea snake, all of that kind of thing. I'm on X currently, just Zoe _Kean. But if you're not on social media, I also have a mailing list. So if you go to my website, which is just zoekean.com, you can sign up for my mailing list, and I won't be blasting you with emails, but there will be information coming out about how to order the book and pre-order the book and where the events are. But yeah, if you want to pre-order the book, you can do that now. It comes out in November 2024. So if it's already out when you're listening to this, just buy it at any local bookstore. But if not, you can pre-order it through, I've got links on my social medias to find where you can do it, or just ring up your local independent bookshop and say, I'd like to buy it, please. And that really helps, like pre-orders just help the book get out there and help it hopefully get to a bigger audience, and, you know, people put them in better bits of the bookshop and all that kind of thing. So if you want to help me out, that would be really lovely.
Yeah, and learn about stromatolites and how they're the basis of the world.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'll post links to all those things in the notes of the show. Well, thanks very much for being on.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Seacreatures Podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by myself, Matt Testoni. If you like the show, jump onto whatever platform you're listening with and give us a review, as it really helps spread the word about Seacreatures Podcast. Production assistance by George McGrath and music by the talented, awesome, and spectacular Dan Musil. Also, if you like the show, jump onto my webpage, www.mtunderwatermedia.com, and you can support us by buying us a coffee, which helps with the running costs of the show. Coming up next time on the Seacreatures Podcast, we're going to be talking all about the weird world of lump suckers. It's been the Seacreatures Podcast. Over and out.